Good.
That's great.
Okay, well, good morning or afternoon, whichever part of the world you're in right now. But we really thank you for joining us for our webinar and a study of credit union workplaces and the future of work. And my name is Michael Downs. I'm Vice President of Client Solutions here at Momentum. And our presenter today is going to be Mark Allgaard, who is President and Director of Client Strategy at Momentum. He's worked for well over a decade with credit unions, helping them create and execute on building strategies. And we also have a very special guest today that we're excited about, Eric Anderson, Director of Workplace Intelligence with Microsoft. And Eric's on the Office 365 team, and among other things, also helps organizations gather data that's available through their technology to make sense of as far as how it applies to workplace strategies. So in July, Eric and his team had an article published in Harvard Business Review, and where they talked about some data that they had gathered on their own employees and how they worked from home and the different impacts that it has on meetings and work days and culture and engagement. So we're excited to have Eric join us. And then from Momentum's perspective, this past spring, we published a white paper that looked at workplace experience of over 1,000 credit union employees at 10 different credit unions. And so we're going to begin the discussion today highlighting some of the insights from this, and then we'll have Eric walk through Microsoft's study and what they learned from their team. And then we'll have a little bit more of a discussion and dive a little bit deeper into Microsoft's study. And then we'll have more discussion around how that, along with how credit unions work, how we can tie all this together to help deliver better success for different credit union organizations. And then Mark will wrap it up with some final recommendations. And then we're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. And so at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat window. We would encourage you, go ahead and submit questions as they occur to you through the conversation, and we'll collect those. And at the end, we'll make sure and answer all those. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. We have a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to let him jump into it. Mark, go ahead and take it away.
Alrighty. Thank you, Michael. And just making sure I'm not muted here. It's really interesting to me how the way different people experience buildings. I mean, buildings are so tangible. We see them, we feel them. Unfortunately, I think we smell them sometimes. But fundamentally, a building exists to make our lives better. And of course, the work we do and the way our organizations exist and thrive in buildings has much more to do with our organizations themselves, our processes, the management structure, our culture, and so on. But we do know that buildings have an impact on people and therefore our businesses. And my slides got a little out of order here, so I'm going to go back. And I think that for our conversation today, it would be good to put this into a little bit of context around what I refer to and many refer to as the changing nature of work. And so we know that the primary nature of work we perform in our workplaces has shifted over the last few decades. As our businesses rely more on knowledge work, the activities taking place in our buildings have changed, right? There's more collaboration across teams. We're working on more complex projects. And these things then require more feedback, more outsourcing, more social connections, right? And when you add in technology tools, like some of the ones Eric works with, we have much different physical workplace needs now than we did 30 years ago. And the choices we have made around the built environment in response to this may have led to some problems. One of the largest problems being noise disruption. We need to talk more to each other to get our work done, and that's a fact. But as the walls have come down to make collaboration easier, we haven't paid enough attention to cognitive work, right? That thought work, the work that requires concentration and therefore uninterrupted quiet. So we've gathered data over the last several years between 2013 and 2020, actually from 11 different credit unions now, covering 22 different buildings with 1,386 credit union staff respondents. Some of this data we collected in partnership with the Filing Research Institute, where Siku Burmese, who's one of their research fellows, and he's a professor at the University of North Carolina now, where he was using this data to look at the impact of the physical work environment on recruiting. We also have gathered this data as well, and we look at it for many different sorts of kind of trends and insights for the credit union industry. We've been making that data available to filing along the way. We use a tool called the Leesman Index Survey, and I'm not going to get really deep into this, but it's a worldwide workplace experience survey. So it's a standardized tool that over 1 million workers around the world have taken, and that's used to collect data about people's experience in the workplace. And one thing I'll add here, I think that's important, is these 11 different organizations were not randomly selected, right? These are organizations that chose to take this survey, and they all were in somewhat of a similar frame of mind at that point. They were thinking about change or reconfiguring, renovating, building new workspaces, right? So there was a commonality between them in that they were likely in maybe somewhat older buildings or buildings that were kind of ready to be revamped. So I do want to point that out. So in our study, in the white paper we published earlier this year, we had 4 insights that I'm going to talk about today, and we're really just going to scratch the surface here. So much data collected, but so much information. We're just going to focus on these four insights. The first centers on choice in work settings. So many workers, and certainly not all, but many workers would benefit from the ability to select the most appropriate setting for completing the task at hand, right? So 45% of credit union workers in our survey showed a pretty complex portfolio of activities that they're taking on a regular basis. And our data shows that overall improvements around mobility and choice are correlated with improved satisfaction and improved productivity in the workplace. But credit unions weren't supporting mobility either inside the office or outside the office very well on average. I think this actually might be one of the largest areas where you'll see a gap between satisfaction with working from home and the corporate office. So that when you're working from home, you do have a bit more flexibility in choosing a setting, be it the couch, the kitchen table, an office, right, throughout the day. So our recommendation here is pretty simple. Focus on the activities that need to take place in your office to complete your work, and then conceive the most appropriate environments, settings, and tools. And then have a culture, support a culture that allows and embraces mobility. Make mobility acceptable. Friction's a funny thing. You take these things one at a time, and many of these annoyances, you can just ignore them, but they tend to pile up and have kind of an overall drag on experience and engagement. And some of these, like interruption, noise disruption, can be really impactful to workers' sense of individual productivity. And we know when a worker does not feel that they are productive and there's impacts to their productivity, they will have a negative feeling or sentiment towards the entire experience in an office, regardless of how great your breakout team meeting rooms are, or how great your boardroom, your client engagement areas are. If they can't feel productive, they won't have a good experience in those areas. So again, pretty straightforward recommendation in this area. Identify the sources of friction and implement a plan to get rid of them. And I think you'll find that many of these friction areas are things you can get rid of possibly quite easily without a major change in the workplace. And by doing that, you give your employees the impression that you care and you're doing something immediately to improve the experience in the workplace and not just waiting for some big project to come along. The impact that the physical work environment has on culture can be surprising, I think, to some people. But if you think about the easiest way people gather information, it's through your eyes. So if your loan department, for example, is working siloed off, heads down, processing loans, what kind of visibility does that team have to the mission of the credit union, to maybe forward moving initiatives that your team has? What we recommend here is that you pull the values out as a team that are most important to you and to your credit union, and think about ways that your building could do a better job in helping your leadership and your staff live those values. Well-being, it's another area, I think, where the contrasts between working at home and the corporate office can be pretty stark. And that's even if you set aside the kind of heightened awareness around well-being in the COVID-19 area, well-being is so important. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't get the basics right, if people aren't comfortable, they don't have fresh air, access to daylight, a pleasant surrounding, the ability to focus without noise interruptions, they're not going to be able to reach any sort of higher levels of innovation or performance. One statistic that's surprising that I think to a lot of folks is the one around general decor or aesthetics. But we know that aesthetics really does play a huge part in the way people experience the physical environment. So aesthetics have an impact on your mood, on stress, on your brain, right? So a more pleasant environment is less stressful for your brain, and it's easier for you to relax and recharge. Our recommendation on well-being is be methodical and be exhaustive. So really think about all of the ways a building and the built environment impact your team members, and find, again, kind of short-term and longer-term solutions or ways to impact those areas of well-being. There's a few resources out there, some guides. I think the most kind of all-encompassing one being the Well Building Standard, which is something that's administered by the United States Green Building Council. They're a group that administers LEED, so the environmental certification many of you might be aware of. So there's also a wellness certification that they help people administer for their buildings. And so now, I think, as I mentioned, the majority of our research is really centered around the corporate work environment, right? And then we dab a little bit into mobility. Now I'm going to pass the conversation on to Eric Anderson with Microsoft, and he's going to talk very much about their research around their team members' experience working from home in the COVID area. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now and mute myself. And Eric, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. And take it away.
Yeah, thanks. Can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Perfect. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. And anytime I get a chance to talk about the work we've been doing and some of the research we've been doing over the last 6 months, I jump at it because it's pretty fascinating. And taking a step back to tell you a little bit about what I do at Microsoft. So my team at Microsoft, we kind of have this unofficial mission that we say amongst ourselves that we're just trying to make work suck less. And we think there's a lot of opportunity to do that. And specifically what we're doing in that space is we've been incubating a business within Microsoft that helps companies use passively collected data from their organizations. So if you think about the workers at a credit union, a large majority of those workers we would call knowledge workers. They're doing really cognitive type of work. It's very collaborative. It may not be very process driven. And oftentimes there's not a lot of ways to measure how successfully that work is being done or how efficiently or effectively it's being done. And the common thing about knowledge workers is they all use technology to do their work. You use things like email, instant messaging, this Zoom call we're on. All of the collaboration that you're doing is via some sort of technology. And when that's done, data is essentially created. We call it the digital exhaust of people collaborating is created. And that data is sitting there and no one's really tapped into that data before. And so what we've been trying to do is help companies take advantage of that. And so they can use that data to do a number of things. But if you think about, Mark mentioned it, the way people collaborate is a big driver of the culture of a company. If you actually have data that you can capture around that and you bring some context about your business into it, all of a sudden you have this wealth of information you can do something with. So, go back to the end of February when we all basically got sent home and we're told not to come back, which we assumed probably wouldn't be that long, but here we are now months later. In fact, I remember the day that I left the office for the last time, I had grabbed a banana for lunch and I ended up not eating it. I left it on my desk and I went home that night. And then I got this email that said, don't come to work the next day. And like 3 weeks later, I thought to myself, man, when I left, there was a banana sitting on my desk. And I was like, I hope someone grabbed that thing and threw it in the garbage. Otherwise, it might be a pretty bad sight. But what we recognize that, hey, this is something that's never really happened before in the workplace. And we should maybe take a look at it, and not having any objectives in mind other than just to see what we learned. We started looking at the data we can get about our broader organization in Microsoft. And then ultimately we started looking at more and more parts of Microsoft through it. And we started by just publishing some blog posts about it. And ultimately it was mentioned that some of this was put together into an HBR article. But we've really been using these learnings, and we've been working now with customers to help them get similar learnings about their companies. And we wanted to just answer some questions like, how are work and life going to be integrated when people are sitting at home and their kids aren't at school and all that sorts of things. So that was a big area. The other one was, we are always really interested in how networks help people do their work. And so if you think of a credit union, not every single group within that credit union is only working within their own silo. There's collaboration that has to happen across the whole credit union. And people form networks when they do that. And they'll form those networks inside of the company, and they'll form those networks outside of the company. And we find that the networks of people are really strong enablers of them to be successful. So we're really curious, when all of a sudden everyone gets sent out of the office, they get sent home, they're disconnected, would they be able to maintain those networks? How would those networks evolve? We had hypotheses like, people's networks would basically just shrink down to those people they were the closest with, and they would lose all of the people on their periphery of their network. So we had these types of hypotheses that we were just wondering, hey, what could we learn as we look through it? So we looked at a bunch of data, and we started to learn some things. And I just thought I'd talk about kind of 3 themes of those. And the first is, we were pretty surprised how quickly the norms changed that we saw that teams were using to get their work done. A couple of those were actually how people were collaborating. So we looked at kind of the makeup of meetings within our organization, and we saw this phenomenon that we started calling the rise of the 30-minute meeting. And what we saw was these short meetings, 30 minutes or less, increased over 20%. So people were spending a lot more times in short meetings. We looked at some of those attributes. They tended to be smaller meetings also. And we did some kind of targeted surveys amongst people to learn more about that. And we found that the reason people were meeting was actually shifting. It wasn't just, hey, I'm having a meeting because I have some, project I'm working on and we need to, get status, or we need to come up with an idea to move it forward. But it was, people were setting up meetings to stay connected, right? So things that they used to be able to do by walking down the hallway or grabbing lunch with someone or things like that. They were shifting into more formalized meetings. But we also saw that longer meetings were actually decreasing, and meetings that were longer than an hour decreased by more than 10%. And what we learned from that was people were actually saying, hey, when I'm sitting remotely on a video conference or a voice conference call, they're saying, hey, we just don't have the stamina to stay engaged longer, right? It's more draining on ourselves to stay engaged in a longer meeting than it is when you're sitting in the room and you kind of have a completely different atmosphere and experience. So that was pretty interesting. Just from a very quick thing happened. We saw this happening within the first 3 to 4 weeks of people being at home, that this was a pretty clear signal that we saw. The other thing that we saw happen right away was the working patterns throughout the day started to shift. So we kind of baselined against a previous period, and you saw kind of activity of collaboration. It could kind of rise and spike in the morning, then it would dip during the lunchtime, then it would rise again in the afternoon and dip right in the evening time, kind of the evening commute time, between 5 and 7 in the evening. And very quickly we saw that morph, and we saw the first thing that happened was the dip at lunchtime started to go away. So there wasn't such a pronounced time when everyone was sort of taking that lunch break in the middle of the day. And we started to see collaboration, especially formalized meetings that typically were happening in the mornings, were shifting to the afternoons. And so we started sort of digging into this, and what we learned was people were having to integrate a lot more within their days, especially when school was still in place in the spring. And a lot of parents were helping their kids with school in the morning, so thus they shifted meetings to the afternoon. And then some of their work that was done outside of meetings via email or instant messaging or whatnot started to sort of spill over into the evening hours. Between like 8 and 11 p.m., we had a pretty drastic increase in Microsoft in email and IM activity in that time period. So this whole concept of the traditional workday pretty quickly started to get thrown out the window, and people were kind of making their own work days. So the thing we actually got pretty worried about that kind of leads into my next theme, which is more around well-being. And Mark talked a lot about well-being as well, is if all of a sudden work days are having less boundaries with their non-work days, are people going to be candidates for burnout? Are they being able to connect and separate from their workday? And what we saw was when we looked at managers, so people who were managing other people within our teams, they actually took a huge amount of the brunt. Their collaboration increased on average by 8 hours per week. So that's basically adding an entire day just on collaboration. And we were realizing that the managers were basically taking the brunt of this massive change, of managing this massive change for their teams. And they were having to deal with the things that they were going through personally, but also what their teams were going through. And, I think luckily Microsoft did make a huge emphasis on enabling managers through that time, providing a lot of resources and that sort of thing. But still, it was something that we didn't really expect to see such a dramatic impact on managers themselves. The flip side of that is the data showed that managers were probably the biggest thing that could make teams successful, kind of responding to the change. In fact, we looked at data about employees and managers and how much time they were spending in one-on-one meetings and what was the potential impact of that. And we saw employees that spent regular time with their managers in a weekly one-on-one, their overall kind of work throughout the pandemic, it increased 60% less than their peers who didn't spend time with their managers in one-on-ones. And that was pretty interesting because all of a sudden we had real data that showed, okay, managers, when they do spend time with their employees, are actually providing a tangible impact on the well-being of those employees with their ability to manage their work and prioritize. And we went and talked with some both employees and managers about that. And it was very clear that there was a lot more focus on prioritization and managing that integration of work and life than we had ever had before in these types of meetings. So that was a pretty positive thing that we saw. The last kind of big theme that came out pretty clearly was around the concept of how do you maintain human connections. And it was clear that those human connections were really important. And we did a couple, again, simple surveys around these aspects, because the data showed us that meetings that we classified as social meetings, just by looking at different topics of meetings, they increased by about 10%. So people were definitely using meetings to just, maintain that social connection with people that they work with. We also saw one-to-one meetings. So a meeting that not necessarily with people in their own team or with their manager or whatnot, but meetings that were just two-person meetings, they increased by 20%. So just the use of those meetings to stay connected to people was clearly being shown in the data. And we then kind of translated this to that question I mentioned in the beginning, or the hypothesis we had about networks. And this is something that I think was really interesting, is we saw across the board, and we actually broadened our look here. We looked at, like 90,000 Microsoft employees, and their networks before and after going to work remotely, the size of their networks essentially remained consistent. So for the most part, everyone was able to maintain the network and the connections they had with employees, which was pretty remarkable, I think. The fact that you take everyone who sat in offices and you send them all home, and they're basically able to maintain a network of the same size was pretty interesting. And we did some further looks into that by looking at different job functions, and we definitely saw those things were different by job functions. So you look at our sales team, for example, they're used to working on the road, and they're kind of always in a mobile state anyway. Their networks remain pretty consistent. If you look at some engineers, for example, even in those times when they were able to maintain their network, they didn't always maintain it with the same sets of people. And so there were some learnings there that were more specific. So the data has been really interesting. We've just been kind of intrigued by it, but the real outcome of it is, what can we do with that data? And so I think across Microsoft, there is a lot of focus on how do we make sure that we're continuing to do things differently to kind of recover from what we've been doing, but then also to reimagine how things might need to be in the future. And a lot of it is just starting with things that are really small, right? So the emphasis on well-being and making sure everyone understands the resources that they have at their disposal. The data about manager one-on-ones was one that really created this campaign to say to managers, hey, make sure you do spend time with your employees. This can be really helpful, and have those regular connections. And then other things like, in my broader org, we have started to do a recharge Friday, every other Friday, where there's no meetings, no Teams collaboration on a Friday. And people can use that for what they need to. It could be to do really deep focused work. It could be to tend to their family. It could be to catch up on other things. But the idea is you've got some time that we as an organization, and we're saying it's okay to take this time to manage what you need to do with your work-life integration to respond from that. So yeah, it's been really interesting. And what we're now doing is starting to think about, as we have some places in the world that are going back into the office, so starting to think about, okay, as we do that, what are the ways this data can help inform that? And specifically around physical workspace, what are the things we think will change? What are the things we think will stay now in this quote unquote new norm? And so that's been an interesting thing as well.
That's great. I appreciate the overview. It's just, one thing that's amazing to me is the way I took your study and what you just described is that you found a lot of positive impacts that came from working from home, like a lot of good news. Particular, the managers finding a more effective way, right, to work with their teams so that they could really help them be more productive, right, and not spin their wheels. I mean, that's really, I think, helpful insights for credit unions. Um, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, now that you're starting to think about the future, right? And I know Microsoft and your campus is undergoing a pretty radical transformation right now. Are there any insights you're gathering in the work from home, data collection that may be driving decisions around the built environment for you guys?
Yeah, that's an interesting space. In fact, even before the pandemic hit, my team has worked pretty closely with the real estate team in Microsoft to think about how this type of data can help inform those decisions we make about real estate. And you can think about it kind of in a couple of perspectives. So one is decisions about what the physical space is actually designed like, right? So it was mentioned at the beginning, Mark, you mentioned that, buildings are really an enabler of people to do their work. And so the better you understand the working patterns that those people are using to do their work, the better you can design the space to give them employees what they need. And so if you think about understanding the collaboration and working patterns of your employees, then you can make decisions about, do we need, breakout rooms? Do we need big conference rooms? Do we need neighborhoods? Do we need big open spaces? Do we need offices? It's like those types of questions are questions that I know Microsoft's real estate team has gone through and tried to answer over the last, probably 5 to 10 years, I would imagine. And they have used this type of collaboration data to help do that. And we've done some experiments to say, hey, let's take this team and let's put them in a 15-person neighborhood that's open space with a bunch of movable furniture and a little breakout room next to it. And then let's put another set of engineers that are essentially doing the same work in a different configuration, and let's measure with data which seems to be more effective, right? So which is driving more collaboration, which is driving more productivity with measures of how that group measures their engineering productivity. And so there's a lot of that has always been happening.
Right.
Specifically with the pandemic, trying to really think about how do we understand in the first stage is who needs to come back to the office first. Right. I think that's the question that everyone's trying to answer. And then the second is what's the most effective way to bring people back in this sort of hybrid scenario where you can't fully occupy your buildings. And so we've been working with Microsoft and with some other customers as well to say, well, if we have this data about collaboration, we can actually look at the people who spend the most time collaborating with other people that they would be co-located with. And we know the capacity of our buildings. And so let's actually say, these are the groups of people that should come back first. And when they come back, they should come back along with these other teams because they spend a lot of time collaborating. And then even optimizing where they sit based upon the amount of collaboration that certain teams do together. Yeah. And so that's something that is being done right now as we're starting to think about what's our strategy of coming back into an office.
It's really interesting. One area that you didn't get into too much, but that really interests me is how does the work from home environment impact the ability organization-wide, right, to drive the business forward? I think you call it business continuity. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on what data points you could be considering to understand how working from home is impacting the mission of the business and executing on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this concept of, maybe there's two parts that I'll hit on. One is the concept of business continuity and how do companies look at that? I think what I have learned especially in kind of the early months of the pandemic from talking with a bunch of customers is historically when they thought about how do I manage risk in my company and get ourselves set up to be prepared to maintain business continuity, a lot of those conversations were around things like infrastructure and supply chain and technology. And maybe when you get into the people side of things, maybe like leadership, having plans around if key leaders leave the company and so forth. But very few companies that I have talked to thought about their full workforce as being super important to how resilient they were to get through a change or a disruption like what we went through. And so I think that first question of business continuity is, do you actually focus on how to maintain the continuity of your people and your teams? And do you have the things in place to do that? And then that morphs into the question about data, which is, what data do you have to help you understand if you are actually maintaining that continuity? And I talked with a gentleman at a pretty large company here in the US. He was the COO of that company, and he said this was like 2 weeks after they sent their employees home, and he said, "Hey, we just sent everybody home. I know things have changed, but I have no idea what has changed, by how much, and where it's changed to in a point where we need to react." He's like, "I have no visibility to that." And so it resulted in this pretty interesting conversation about, well, what are the types of things that you are worried about? And so then when you get into this conversation of data, there's this set of things that companies have always struggled to measure around their employee well-being and culture and all those sorts of stuff. And really the only traditional way that companies have done that is through surveys. And this is where we think like bringing new technology into that conversation around what data you can get your hands on is a game changer in how you can manage your business, because all of a sudden you've got near real-time data that you can track things that are pretty tied closely with the culture of a company, like how people are collaborating and how they're working together and how much time they're spending working and at what times of the day is that happening. And it gives you that view of, are things changing over time? And if they're changing, we can react to that. And we've tried to, in parts of Microsoft, we've set up these little dashboards that leaders have that they can see, aggregated at the team level. It's not about monitoring your employees, but it's looking for those places where we think, hey, we might need to go focus here because things look like they may be going in the wrong direction. We see after hours work spiking in this team over here. And, they used to have on average an hour of after hours work. Now they've got 10 hours of after hours work. Let's go focus on that. Or we used to see these two teams collaborating together all the time. And now that's stopped happening. And so we think that might have a business impact. So let's go focus there. So I think that concept of bringing new data into the conversation that can be something that's monitored, much more proactively than doing an annual engagement survey, I think is really useful.
That is very interesting. I think right now, just remind folks that if you do have any questions for Eric or me, feel free to put those into the chat box. And Eric, I think briefly, just because in the name of time, I'm going to ask you a couple quick questions. The rise of the 30-minute meeting, so important, or so interesting, I think, and impactful, right? Do you anticipate this shifting back when there's a move back to face-to-face rather than virtual? And do you have any thoughts on how you could kind of preserve the culture around shorter meetings in the future?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind there is I don't think the workplace will go back to exactly what it was before, right? I think there's going to be a lot more of this hybrid work, which I think will ultimately keep a lot of that shorter meeting culture when you've got that hybrid work where people are spending more time working remotely. I think some of it will go away by nature of some of those short meetings that are being used to just maintain connections are replaced with physical doing that physically, in the workspace. But at the same time, I think if you're a company and you're kind of looking at this type of thing and you've got data about it, you can start to see if it's shifting away and you're starting to get this meeting bloat again, and you can react to it. So I think that's another thing that is a change for the better, is companies are actually starting to think about this kind of stuff. And I think that ultimately will help, if the old sayings of you never manage what you don't measure, well, having the data will help companies kind of keep their eyes on these things. And if they like the shifts that have been made, then they can actually try and maintain those just by having information about it.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. So I know that you're no longer, are currently doing that slog of a commute down Montlake Boulevard and across Lake Washington, right, to the Microsoft campus. So you have an extra hour a day in your pocket. Right? What are you using that time for? More work? And I hope not. I mean, and when you do, I assume you will return, a large part to the office. I mean, how hard is it going to be to give that up?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the morning commute has turned into more work, which I should probably do a better job of turning that into something that's better for me personally. But the evening commute has definitely turned into me having more dinners with my family. Like that has been a huge positive for me, and something that I think I've realized that I should forever try and retain that in some way. And so I think that's a positive. I think the one thing that I have missed about the commute is the commute was actually a good way for me to kind of close out my day, especially in the evening. In the morning, more about like time for me to reflect on, hey, here's what I got to do. And at night, thinking about, okay, here were the important things of that day. Let me get myself ready for tomorrow, and then have that physical disconnection from work. That's something that is gone that I actually miss, right? And so I would welcome that back, but I think I will definitely try and maintain some of the things I've gotten from not having that commute. I definitely enjoy it.
Yeah, here. I think I'm right about the same boat as you. Though I'm actually in our office today. We're back part-time. We've broken up into some teams. So I'm going to move on to the last part of our conversation here. I hope everyone can see my presentation now, and just wanted to take a moment and give a few recommendations, and really got to kind of start by saying I've done a bit of a straw poll with the credit unions we work with, and it does seem that there's a pretty large group of you who intend to return to the physical work environment, the corporate office, and largely the same way you were working there before, which isn't terribly surprising to me. But I think that there are a lot of prognostications out there and people who are kind of defining and declaring how the office will be. And I think, frankly, we just don't know, in my opinion, that the data is just not available yet as to the impact remote work will have on organizations in the long term. So that said, in addition to the insights we shared earlier, I think we do have a few tips on how you could perhaps start to blend a better existence between the corporate office and a work from home program, something that's going to benefit your organization. And so the first, just gather the evidence and use a tool like a scorecard. So it doesn't have to be all at none, which is, I think, kind of what Eric was describing, kind of more of a hybrid environment. And it's certainly not going to be a one size fits all scenario. Some credit unions may be in costly urban centers with terrible commutes, difficult securing real estate, hard to get access to talent, and high cost of living, right? Well, the benefits of remote work may be greater for those credit unions than ones who don't have those challenges. So those are things to consider. And another is really, which of your team members, which of your departments are best suited for remote work? What evidence could you gather around those teams, around maybe how well remote work is working now, to help you decide whether that's something you want to try, define success around, and then measure data to see if it's working. Second bit of advice really is to build your solutions both from the bottom up and the top down. And so you're certainly going to want to talk to your employees and find out what they think they need and what is working well about work from home or work from the corporate office. But just be aware that self-reporting, especially in a time like this, is not going to be free from bias and influence. If you ask an employee how well work from home is working a week after 2 of their children started remote school, and it's in the soggy Pacific Northwest, October weather, their response might be a lot different than how it was going back in July on a beautiful day when they appreciated the flexibility to go outside for a walk. So be wary of self-reporting, and also when I say build the solution from the top down, really be thinking about what your credit union needs as a whole for the business in terms of collaboration and innovation, recruiting, training for team members. Third, I think this is really important. You do have a bit of a new competitor, and that's the work from home experience. So when you do return team members to the office, it's going to be very fresh in their mind what they liked and enjoyed about working from home. And that is going to create a negative sentiment around those areas in the corporate office. So if you can identify those areas, the top areas that were better about working from home, then you can come up with a strategy to address the gap and perhaps make the work from the corporate office experience more equivalent to the work from home in that area. The fourth, we talked about this a bit, is just nurture a cultural acceptance of remote working. The genie's out of the bottle, so to speak. You've given employees permission to work remotely. You've built some of the infrastructure and the processes around remote work. So perhaps consider remote work as just one of your tools, again, a hybrid environment or a way to create a perk or a benefit for your team and your team members. And lastly, do focus on well-being. You really can't go wrong here. So be thinking about work-life balance, disruption and stress, what people like about flex time or that free time they got from not commuting. Even things like density in the work environment, right? Maybe corporate offices were getting too dense and that was a problem. So perhaps think about how you can provide more space and ability for people to focus. And on that, I think I'm going to go back here to Michael. If you want to, I don't know if we have any questions.
Yeah, we're about out of time. We have a couple questions that maybe I can just get one in out of respect for our time here. But early on, Eric had mentioned, some of the additional burden on managers. And the question is, what do you suggest managers do to help make the burden more manageable? So do you see that as a technological solution, an operational solution, both? But how do we avoid burning out our first line managers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know if I have a really great answer for it. I can tell you what one of the things that we did at Microsoft was a real emphasis on kind of the soft side of that, which is making sure managers know that it's not all on them, right? Like, I think we saw a lot of burden because they were trying to help their teams help their teams from a well-being perspective, also make sure that business was continuing to move forward. Just a lot of responsibility, and this emphasis on, hey, managers, it's not all on your shoulders, and you need to focus on yourself as well. And there was just a really big push on for managers to focus on themselves. So I don't know if that's the ultimate answer, but it's one thing that was done at Microsoft, because I think that was something that is almost like a no-brainer. Let's go try it and see if it works. And I think from my team's perspective, I've gotten pretty positive feedback from my managers on that. I think ensuring technology works is always helpful, because then managers don't have to deal with challenges that are associated with that. But that's how we approached it. So I don't know if it's a great answer, but that's the experience that I have there.
No, it's good. I'll just do one more here, and either Mark or Eric, given that this is obviously an unprecedented time, how long would you recommend or expect for the remote work or work from home norms to emerge, so that you could say there's actually a baseline to benchmark against? Is it a year, 2 years, or, I mean, do you have any thoughts around that?
I mean, I can share one thing just from what we've seen in the data. Like, we've seen the working patterns essentially start to level off. So in my perspective, what we see in collaboration patterns, they've kind of hit a more stable. So we saw like big spikes in things in the month following, when everyone was sort of sent home, and then stuff started to come down a little bit, and then they sort of leveled off. And we've seen that level off now, since, like June, July, in the data that we look at around collaboration patterns. Now there's other aspects of that I think move a little more slowly, but for collaboration signals specifically, we've seen it level off.
Okay. Mark, did you want to add anything?
I mean, anecdotally, I think we've seen the same thing, both in the credit unions we speak with and on our own team, kind of a settling in, I think, to a pattern here.
Okay. Well, we're a little bit over time, so we'll wrap it up there. We would offer to share the material that was presented today. We'll note on the last slide of the material, there are some links, including a link to Eric's HBR article, the white paper that we referenced from Momentum, that we can send that out to everyone that participated today. Mark just brought that up on screen. And then, of course, if you have any additional questions or thoughts or anything that comes to mind, feel free to reach out to us. But we certainly appreciate you giving up 45 minutes of your day to spend some time with this. We think this stuff is really interesting, and please let us know if we can offer up any other insights. But with that, we'll conclude the webinar, and we really appreciate everyone participating.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.